What if a $200 million fortune was never meant to stay in the family, and that decision shattered everything people thought they understood about legacy? For decades, Rob Reiner has stood as one of Hollywood's most outspoken moral voices. A filmmaker whose work defined generations, and an activist whose influence reached far beyond cinema into education, equality, and public conscience. To the world, his legacy represents conviction, discipline, and the belief that wealth should serve a greater purpose. But behind that public image sits a far more uncomfortable question. What happens when a parent believes that leaving a massive fortune, nearly $200 million built over a lifetime, would do more harm than good to their own children? When money, instead of being a gift, is seen as a threat to independence, ambition, and purpose? This isn't a story about greed. It isn't even about inheritance in the traditional sense. It's a story about what happens when intention collides with emotion, and when a philosophy meant to strengthen the next generation leaves those closest feeling pushed aside. Because when the world applauds a decision involving $200 million and calls it principled, the people living inside that legacy may experience it very differently. For most families, the reading of a will is meant to bring clarity, even closure. But when the number attached to that will approaches $200 million, clarity becomes shock and closure becomes confusion. Because at that scale, inheritance stops being a private matter and turns into a statement, a declaration about values, priorities, and who a legacy is truly meant to serve. When word began to circulate that nearly $200 million would not move through the family in the expected way, the reaction wasn't disbelief alone. It was disorientation, not because the money was gone, but because of what its absence symbolized. For the people closest to Rob Reiner, this wasn't just about assets being redirected. It felt like the family itself had been quietly removed from the final chapter of a story they thought they belonged to. Publicly, the idea made sense. Rob Reiner had spent decades advocating for causes larger than himself: education, equality, social responsibility. Directing wealth toward charity aligned perfectly with the image the world already knew. To many observers, it looked principled, even admirable. A final act consistent with a lifetime of conviction. But inside a family, consistency doesn't always feel like care. When a fortune of this size is deliberately kept out of reach, the question isn't simply why the money went elsewhere. The deeper question is what that decision was meant to say. Was it an act of faith in independence, or a sign that the family was never meant to be part of the legacy at all? This is where the story truly begins, not with greed, not with entitlement, but with the moment a $200 million decision forced a family to confront something far more painful than loss, the fear that they had been written out of the meaning behind everything that came before. When people on the outside talk about a fortune this large, the assumption is almost automatic. Anger must be about greed. Pain must be about entitlement. But families who have lived for years inside the shadow of public ideals often describe something very different. When nearly $200 million is redirected away from the family, the shock doesn't come from losing access to wealth. It comes from what that decision appears to say about belonging. Those closest to Rob Reiner had spent their lives watching him pour time, energy, and conviction into causes meant to help strangers they would never meet. Education, equality, social responsibility. That commitment was never hidden. But when the same commitment extended all the way to the final chapter, leaving almost nothing materially tied to the family, it created a painful contradiction that was hard to ignore. Because inside a family, inheritance is rarely just about financial security. It's symbolic. It answers an unspoken question: do we matter in the story you're leaving behind? When that answer feels unclear, even the strongest belief in independence can start to feel like distance instead of trust. Especially when the redirection involves a number as staggering as $200 million. People close to families in similar situations often describe a specific kind of hurt, not outrage, but disbelief. A sense that the values celebrated in public had somehow become louder than the relationships formed in private. The message, whether intended or not, can feel brutally simple. The world came first, and that's where the emotional fracture deepens. Because no one was asking for luxury. No one was asking for protection from life. What lingered was something far more personal, the feeling that when everything was counted, measured, and assigned purpose, the family itself hadn't been counted in the same way. So the question shifted. It stopped being about money altogether. It became about recognition, about whether decades of loyalty, presence, and quiet support had been seen, or whether the final act of generosity had quietly closed the door on that acknowledgement forever. After a decision this large, most people expect answers. Statements, clarifications. Something to explain why nearly $200 million would move away from the family and into causes beyond it. But what followed instead was silence. Not the absence of care, but the presence of restraint. Everything unfolded slowly, privately, and away from public view, in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Those familiar with Rob Reiner's personal life have long noted how tightly he guarded the line between public conviction and private matters. Publicly, he spoke loudly and without hesitation. Privately, moments of difficulty were handled without spectacle. No rush to control the narrative, no immediate attempt to justify the decision, just waiting for processes to complete, for emotions to settle, for the moment when words might finally feel necessary. But waiting has a cost. When nothing is said, uncertainty grows. Inside the family, questions had no clear place to land. Outside, curiosity quickly turned into speculation. And speculation, when fueled by a number as staggering as $200 million, doesn't stay quiet for long. Silence stops being neutral. It becomes a message others begin to interpret for you. For some observers, the quiet reinforced the image of principle, a man so committed to his beliefs that he didn't feel the need to explain them. For others, it felt cold, detached, almost clinical. The same restraint that once read as dignity now began to feel like distance, especially to those who were already struggling to understand what the decision meant for them personally. And that's where pressure quietly entered the room, not through confrontation, but through expectation. When a public figure known for moral certainty makes a choice this consequential, the world wants clarity. It wants reassurance. It wants a reason it can accept. But inside the family, the silence wasn't about image. It was about absorbing the weight of a choice that couldn't be undone. So the question lingered unanswered and increasingly heavy. When privacy collides with public curiosity and restraint collides with emotional need, who does the silence protect? And how long can waiting hold before it starts to feel like something else entirely? It didn't take long for the silence to be filled. Once the idea spread that nearly $200 million would be directed away from the family and toward charitable causes, public reaction fractured almost instantly. For some, the decision was hailed as the ultimate act of integrity, proof that Rob Reiner lived exactly as he preached, a man who believed wealth should serve society, not bloodlines. A final statement that values mattered more than comfort. Supporters framed it as rare moral consistency. In a world where dynastic wealth is often criticized, this felt like a refusal to participate in the cycle. The argument was simple and powerful. Children should build their own lives, just as their parents did. Anything else, they argued, risked turning inheritance into entitlement. From that angle, the decision looked not just defensible but necessary. But admiration wasn't the only response. Others saw something far colder. To them, redirecting a fortune of this size away from one's own children didn't look like discipline. It looked like emotional abandonment dressed up as principle. Critics questioned whether generosity toward the world had come at the cost of responsibility at home, whether moral clarity in public had blurred compassion in private, and that's where the story became uncomfortable. Because both interpretations could exist at the same time. The same $200 million decision could be read as inspiring or devastating, depending entirely on where one stood. What felt like justice to strangers could feel like erasure to family. What looked like strength to supporters could feel like punishment to those living inside the consequences. As debate grew louder, the family remained silent. No clarifications, no attempts to sway opinion, which only intensified the divide. Supporters filled the gap with praise, critics filled it with doubt, And in between sat a family absorbing the weight of a decision now being argued by people who would never have to live with it. At that point, the question was no longer about money or charity. It was about ownership of the narrative. Who gets to define what this legacy means, the public that applauds it or the family that feels it? To understand the decision, you have to understand the belief behind it. For Rob Reiner, money was never neutral. He didn't see wealth as comfort or protection. He saw it as influence, something that could either sharpen purpose or quietly dull it. Over the years, he spoke often about independence, about the danger of unearned security, and about how easily financial safety can replace ambition. From his perspective, leaving nearly $200 million to his children wasn't generosity, it was risk. A risk that comfort would arrive before purpose. That struggle would be softened before character had fully formed. In his mind, the most loving thing a parent could do was not to remove hardship, but to allow it to teach. Life, he believed, was the real instructor, work, effort, and consequences included. That philosophy shaped how he viewed legacy. Success to him wasn't measured by what his children received, but by whether they could keep moving forward without him. He believed independence was proof of strength, not absence of love. And when he looked at his children as adults, he reportedly saw people capable of standing on their own, people who didn't need a financial cushion to define their worth or direction. Charity, on the other hand, fit seamlessly into that worldview. Directing wealth outward felt purposeful. It allowed money to keep working not as comfort, but as impact, education, social programs, equality initiatives. These weren't abstract ideals to him. They were extensions of the same discipline and responsibility he believed in at home, just applied on a larger scale. But philosophy doesn't always translate emotionally. What feels principled to one generation can feel withholding to another. And while this belief may have been consistent with how he lived, it didn't account for how it would be felt. The intention was clear, the impact was not. And that gap between what was meant and what was experienced would become the fault line everything else began to crack along. Beliefs are meant to guide, not to injure. But inside a family, even the most carefully reasoned philosophy can land with unexpected force. What Rob Reiner saw as consistency, others experienced as finality. The same decision that felt disciplined and purposeful from one side began to feel deeply personal from the other. For those closest to the choice, the pain didn't come from disagreement with charity itself. It came from the feeling of being left out of the meaning behind the decision. When nearly $200 million was assigned purpose elsewhere, it didn't just redirect money, it redirected significance. It raised a quiet but devastating thought. If the ultimate act of generosity didn't include us, what does that say about our place in this story? This is where philosophy stops being abstract. Independence, when lived as an ideal, can feel empowering. But when applied without emotional context, it can feel like distance. What was meant as trust you are strong enough can be received as withdrawal you are on your own. And once that interpretation takes hold, no explanation feels complete enough to undo it. People close to families facing moments like this often describe a specific kind of grief. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of reinterpretation. Memories are revisited, conversations are re-examined, past silences suddenly feel louder. The decision begins to color everything that came before it, even moments that once felt secure. And this is the cruel irony at the center of the story. The very values meant to protect growth, resilience, self-reliance, responsibility become the source of emotional fracture. Not because they were wrong, but because they were experienced differently by those who had to live with their consequences. At that point, the question is no longer whether the decision was principled. It's whether principle alone can carry the weight of love, and whether a legacy built on strength can survive when strength is all that's left. At some point, the debate stopped being about money altogether. It became a struggle over meaning. Once nearly $200 million was framed as a moral act, the story no longer belonged solely to the family. It belonged to everyone who believed they understood what that decision represented. Supporters spoke with certainty, critics spoke with outrage, and the legacy itself began to take on a life of its own. For the public, the narrative was simple. A man of principle made a hard choice and stood by it. The money went where it could do the most good. The message felt clean, even inspiring. In that version of the story, there was little room for nuance, and even less room for the emotional reality inside the family. Complexity slowed the message. Doubt weakened the clarity. But inside the family, the experience was entirely different. A legacy is not an abstract idea. It is lived. It is felt. It carries memories, relationships, and moments no outsider ever sees. When the world began applauding a decision that had left them questioning their place, it created a second layer of pain, the feeling that their grief was being overridden by someone else's certainty. That is the collision at the heart of this story. Public legacy demands simplicity. Family experience is never simple. One side needs a symbol, the other needs acknowledgement. And when those needs collide, the question becomes unavoidable. Who gets to define what a legacy means? The millions who celebrate it from a distance, or the people who live inside its consequences every day? As praise and criticism grew louder, the gap widened. What felt like validation to the public felt like erasure to the family. And once a legacy becomes something debated rather than shared, it stops being a bridge. It becomes a dividing line. Away from the family conflict, the money didn't disappear. Nearly $200 million was directed into causes that had defined Rob Reiner's public life for decades. Education, early childhood development, health initiatives, social programs built around the belief that long-term change begins before anyone ever steps into adulthood. These weren't last-minute choices. They reflected a worldview he had invested in consistently, quietly, and with intent. The impact was real. Programs expanded. Funding stabilized organizations that had struggled for years. Millions of lives, most of them far removed from Hollywood, benefited in tangible ways. To supporters, this was proof that the decision worked. The money didn't sit idle. It moved. It mattered. And in that sense, the legacy did exactly what it was designed to do. It kept working. But this is where the final irony emerges. The same clarity that made the decision effective on a societal level made it brutal on a personal one. Charity, by design, has beneficiaries who are visible only in aggregate, numbers, outcomes, measurable progress. Families, by contrast, experience impact individually, emotionally, in moments that don't show up in reports or headlines. So, while the world could point to improved programs and broader access, the family was left grappling with a different reality. Impact without inclusion, purpose without reassurance. The success of the decision in public didn't soften how it felt in private. In some ways, it sharpened it. This is the paradox at the center of the story. A fortune used to uplift countless strangers while leaving unresolved questions at home. A legacy that succeeded everywhere except the place where meaning was expected to be most intimate. And that raises the quietest, most unsettling question of all. Can a legacy be considered complete if the people closest to it feel left outside its purpose? Before the money ever became a moral question, it was the result of decades of work. The nearly $200 million at the center of this story wasn't inherited, discovered, or won overnight. It was built slowly, across a lifetime inside the entertainment industry, through a rare combination of creative success, ownership, and long-term control. The foundation of that fortune came from film, not just acting, but directing, producing, and retaining influence behind the camera. Hit after hit turned creative vision into financial leverage. Box office success was only part of it. Back-end profit participation meant that projects continued paying long after their theatrical runs ended. What looked like single successes stacked quietly over time. Then came ownership. Production companies, television deals, long-running properties that never stopped generating revenue, shows and films that remained in rotation, licensing agreements that renewed year after year, and intellectual property that aged into assets. While many Hollywood careers rise and fall, this one consolidated. Real estate added another layer. Strategic purchases made decades earlier grew alongside the Los Angeles market. Homes that were once simply places to live became high-value holdings. Properties appreciated, rentals generated steady income. What began as stability turned into multiplication, and behind it all was discipline. The money wasn't spent recklessly or publicly displayed. It was managed, reinvested, and protected. The fortune grew not because of extravagance, but because of restraint, the same restraint that would later define what happened to it. By the time the number approached $200 million, it wasn't just wealth. It was proof of a worldview that valued control, foresight, and responsibility. And that context matters. Because the decision to redirect the money wasn't impulsive, it followed the same logic that built it in the first place, which makes the final tension unavoidable. If the fortune was created through independence and long-term thinking, was it only logical that it would be used the same way? Or does the origin of wealth place an obligation on how it should be shared when the story reaches its end? Before the money ever became a moral question, it was the result of decades of work. The nearly $200 million at the center of this story wasn't inherited, discovered, or won overnight. It was built slowly, across a lifetime inside the entertainment industry, through a rare combination of creative success, ownership, and long-term control. The foundation of that fortune came from film. Not just acting, but directing, producing, and retaining influence behind the camera. Hit after hit turned creative vision into financial leverage. Box office success was only part of it. Back-end profit participation meant that projects continued paying long after their theatrical runs ended, what looked like single successes stacked quietly over time. Then came ownership. Production companies, television deals, long-running properties that never stopped generating revenue. Shows and films that remained in rotation, licensing agreements that renewed year after year, and intellectual property that aged into assets. While many Hollywood careers rise and fall, this one consolidated. Real estate added another layer. Strategic purchases made decades earlier grew alongside the Los Angeles market. Homes that were once simply places to live became high-value holdings. Properties appreciated, rentals generated steady income. What began as stability turned into multiplication, and behind it all was discipline. The money wasn't spent recklessly or publicly displayed. It was managed, reinvested, and protected. The fortune grew not because of extravagance, but because of restraint, the same restraint that would later define what happened to it. By the time the number approached $200 million, it wasn't just wealth. It was proof of a worldview that valued control, foresight, and responsibility. And that context matters, because the decision to redirect the money wasn't impulsive. It followed the same logic that built it in the first place, which makes the final tension unavoidable. If the fortune was created through independence and long-term thinking, was it only logical that it would be used the same way? Or does the origin of wealth place an obligation on how it should be shared when the story reaches its end?